Hello, everyone. This is Colleen Milton, and on behalf of BigPanda and 451 Research, I would like to welcome you and say thanks for attending today's webcast titled Autonomous or Bust, What is the Future of IT Operations? Leading off the discussion today will be Nancy Gohring, who is Senior Analyst in Application and Infrastructure Performance at 451 Research. Following Nancy will be Mohan Kampella, who is EVP of Product at BigPanda. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. To ask a question, simply type it in the question box on your screen. We will answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A session, and we'll respond to all unanswered questions via email after the webcast concludes. This presentation and slides are available for download. And finally, please provide feedback at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nancy.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks to BigPanda for inviting me, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some of the challenges that are facing IT ops organizations, and also make some suggestions about some emerging approaches that I'm seeing some companies successfully embrace to solve some of these challenges. And so to sort of frame the discussion about challenges that are facing IT ops organizations today, I'd like to step back even further and talk sort of big picture about what's driving IT ops today. And I think that there's an argument to be made that the customer experience is a really big and important driver behind what IT ops is doing today. With software becoming increasingly central to so many businesses, the experience that customers have interacting with applications and services is really crucial. And so what I'm showing you here is a survey question where we asked IT decision makers as well as line of business people who have some role in technology decision making about what are the most common barriers that they face to improving customer experience. And you can see that the top answer here at 40% of respondents is keeping up with rising customer expectations. And I'll dive into that a little bit deeper in just a minute, but really what's behind that is this interest in moving fast in order to iterate and serve customers better. And the second answer, top answer here, 29%, was difficulty in finding talented and skilled workers, and the skills gap is also a really difficult challenge that we hear a lot of organizations face with. And again, I'll dive into that a little bit more in a couple slides. We also, I think this third answer is really interesting. 27% of people said that complexity of existing legacy applications is a barrier to improving customer experience. I really interpret that to imply challenges around hybrid environments, because we're increasingly seeing that most organizations expect to be hybrid. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in a minute. And then finally, overcoming organizational silos. And I'm seeing a lot of experimentation around organizational models that I think is helping solve some challenges, but also, frankly, presenting some new challenges. So I'm going to talk about each of these four highlighted items a little bit more for just a couple minutes, and then we'll talk a little bit about some solutions that I'm seeing some organizations embrace. So in terms of being able to quickly respond to customer demands, we're seeing a lot of organizations embrace a bunch of new technologies. So this is a survey question. It was specifically put to a DevOps-oriented audience, and we asked about which cloud-native technologies and practices are important to their organizations. And you can see microservices top the list, followed by containers. And when we dive deeper in our surveys and ask people specifically about container adoption, one of the primary reasons that they say that they adopt containers is in order to move faster. So it allows people or development and DevOps organizations to more quickly iterate, build new features and capabilities, and push them out. So we're seeing all of these new kinds of technologies come into technology environments, but that creates some new challenges in terms of monitoring and operations. And some of that is really, frankly, pretty simple in terms of people on those teams needing to gain some new skills around these new technologies. And in fact, the skill shortage is something that we hear a lot of people talk about. So when we do our surveys, we also do a number of interviews with IT decision makers. And this is a quote that I pulled from one of those interviews that I thought was really telling. So this person says that complexity is a big concern. Subject matter expertise in this space is really difficult to come by. And this person says even the vendors that are producing these products are having trouble finding and managing key resources on their side. I thought that was just a really interesting observation that this person made. This person is obviously really suffering from the skill shortage. And we've dug a little bit deeper into this topic, and it's really interesting how broad the skill shortage is. So when we ask people specifically what kind of skills they're missing, it's very cloud focused. So despite the fact that the cloud's been around for quite a while and people have been adopting it at a rapid pace, it's still creating challenges for IT teams. And in this blue box, I think this is a really telling trend. So in 2016, when we asked questions about the skills gap, 50% of respondents told us that they were experiencing a cloud skills gap. And this year that jumped to 90%. So 90% of people we asked said that they had a cloud skills gap. And this becomes particularly acute in IT organizations that are being asked to do more with less. So I thought this was also a really interesting pair of questions we asked. So on the left, what we asked was, we were targeting specifically IT infrastructure teams, and we asked them how the amount of work for their team had changed over the last year. And 64% said it had increased. And then we asked them how the size of their team was expected to change over the next 12 months. And most people, 57%, said they were expecting no change. 12% was actually expecting that their team size would shrink. And so not only is there a skill gap, these teams are being asked to do more, and they're not being able to add additional human resources to help them manage that workload. And then at the same time, I just wanted to make reference to hybrid again. So here was in a survey question, we asked people about their execution environment, and the majority of people, 62%, said they were moving toward a hybrid IT environment. 17%, interestingly enough, said they're moving completely off-premise. So there's definitely a very serious shift towards hybrid. And so my point here is there's a lot of challenges that companies are experiencing around trying to drive the customer experience, adopting new technologies in order to do that, and then struggling to get the skills and the team to manage and operate these new technologies and approaches and environments like hybrid. And the problem really becomes acute in organizations that are trying to continue to use traditional approaches. So if you've got a whole bunch of legacy type of tools that tend to only offer visibility about one piece of a complex application and environment, you're likely to be faced with alert storms because these tools may not understand the relationship between the different components that comprise an application. And so when one problem occurs, it can very often set off a chain of issues, and each of those issues generates an alert, and it becomes not only maddening because you have this huge volume of alerts coming at you, but very difficult to figure out which alert represents the cause of the problem. Another issue that I hear a lot of organizations struggle with are these contentious war rooms. So if you're in that scenario where you have these very siloed tools, you very often have a bunch of specialized people. Each of them is just looking at their one tool. That tool is not aware of what's happening in these other environments. And then everybody is working to convince everyone else that the piece of the application that they're responsible for is not the one that's having the problem. So I'm sure everyone is familiar with this, or at least has heard some horror stories. But these are really the big problems that I hear people suffer through. And so let's talk a little bit about some things that people are doing to try to solve some of these challenges. And one of them is embracing automation. So if you're on a team that is facing a skills gap and also struggling with too much work, automation can obviously be a really good approach to try to lighten the load. So there's often, repetitive tasks that some operations organizations spend a lot of time doing, or just very simple tasks that it's really not necessary for your people with really great experience to spend their time doing. And so turning to automation can be a really good solution. So let's look a little bit more about what is, what people are thinking about right now in terms of automation, and then what you should think about if you're trying to embrace it more. So we tried to get a finger on the pulse of where teams are right now in terms of automation. So we asked IT decision makers about the level of automation in their IT environments. And 50% said mostly manual with some automated processes. 38% said mostly automated with some manual processes. So this is decent. I mean, 38%, that segment is probably, something to, it's not bad. I wouldn't necessarily criticize that. 5% said highly automated. I guess I think that this is decent. I think that it would be better if more organizations were more automated than they are. And I think we have an indication that a lot of organizations do, in fact, aspire to be more automated, because we also asked the people who took this survey how they expected to change their investment in IT automation in the coming year. And a full 75% said they expected to increase their investment in automation. So that's pretty significant. That's a really large portion of respondents who said that they were planning to increase their investment in automation. But I will caution that there's a lot of folks that already recognize that it's not necessarily totally easy to get into automation. So it's not just a matter of buying a tool and switching it on. There's definitely some skills required. And I thought this quote from someone we interviewed as part of one of our surveys was really interesting. So this person said that they wish they'd known at the beginning how to effectively transition administrators into being developers. We've started down the road, but even now, still only half of our infrastructure staff are proficient at doing automation. We need the rest of them moved over. So I think that's really interesting. Obviously, there is some skill involved here. And the other thing to consider as you're moving down the automation road is that there's some fear out there that it's possible that automation might replace people's jobs. So we asked that specifically. We said, what do you think the likelihood is of being replaced by IT automation in 5 years? So, I think this is a good sign. About 54% of people said that they thought it was either impossible, very unlikely, or somewhat unlikely that they'd be replaced by automation. An additional 16% was pretty neutral. They said neither likely nor unlikely. But there's some people who clearly have concerns about this. So 18% said they thought it was somewhat likely they'd be replaced, and 8% said very likely. 3% are absolutely certain. So there's, I would lean towards the folks who think it's unlikely to be replaced. So let's think back, right? Most organizations are facing some sort of a skills gap, and they're also overworked. They've got too much work to do. Automation is a really good approach to alleviating these overworked teams. And so I think if people can retrain and gain some new automation skills, they can become very valuable to their organization. And then another approach beyond automation is to begin to unify data and tools across your environment to eliminate some of those silos that I referenced earlier that create some very specific challenges. And so what you're going to want to do is and there's different approaches to doing this, but you're going to want to correlate some of the data that you're collecting across your application environment, application and infrastructure environments, so that you can get visibility into what's going on in a distributed application. And for certain, you also want to be able to correlate insight about workloads that are running across execution environments, so both on-prem and in cloud environments. And once you do this, you'll see a bunch of benefits that will improve on some of those challenges that I talked about earlier. So you'll support collaboration because everyone on your teams are going to be able to get a broader view about how systems are performing together, and that makes it much easier to find the root cause of the problem and then, of course, solve problems faster. So again, there's a number of approaches to doing this, but it's pretty key in today's complex and dynamic environments to be able to unify the view into the application infrastructure environment in order to be able to better identify the cause of problems and solve them faster. So finally, what I want to touch on is making sure that ops is a part of DevOps, because we're seeing more and more embracing of DevOps practices, but there's some pitfalls in terms of ops, and I want to talk through that a little bit with you. So what I've been seeing is a bit of an evolution in terms of the way that IT ops is handled in a lot of organizations. So traditionally, you had an ops team. They did monitoring. They responded when problems occurred. They solved them. And you had separate development teams that wrote code. And then we began to see a lot of organizations embrace DevOps practices. And what happened in this phase, particularly in enterprises, is you ended up with a whole bunch of these autonomous DevOps groups that did some ops. So they would be responsible for monitoring their own applications or microservices and solving those problems. You still had development teams. They often were working on legacy applications and were primarily responsible for writing code. And then you had the ops teams that were still around, and there was this gap. There's a lot of uncertainty, I think, in this phase about who's doing what in terms of operations. What is the ops team doing? What is the DevOps team doing? And what I see happen here is performance drops. And one of the there's really two key reasons that I've seen application performance drop in these organizations. One is typically those many DevOps teams are allowed to choose whatever monitoring tools they want. And the downside to that is that all of those teams have their own monitoring tools. They're only looking at their service or microservice, and often no one is responsible for looking at the customer experience, for understanding the performance of all of the services combined that deliver an application or a service to a customer. And so people don't know when problems are occurring, and there's difficulty understanding how services are working together. And so when performance problems occur, it's really challenging to respond to them. And there's this tool sprawl issue, right? So you see the number of tools going up as all of these DevOps teams choose their own, and you see performance going down. Fortunately, what I've seen is a lot of those organizations begin to evolve a bit more. So they notice that these problems are occurring. Sometimes they end up evolving that central team that used to be called an ops team into maybe an observability team. Maybe they're still called the ops team. But what often happens is they take a little bit of control, not necessarily over doing the monitoring and fixing problems, but in many cases for running monitoring tools. They might be offering them as a service to the DevOps users, and they're ensuring that somebody is taking responsibility for visibility into the end user customer experience. And sometimes that's that central observability or ops team. Sometimes it's a product team, but just making sure that that's not falling through the cracks. And then I see a future stage that, frankly, in my mind is a little bit ill-defined, but it uses a lot of automation in terms of identifying problems and, in many cases, automatically remediating them. So I just want to back up a couple of statements that I said here. I thought this was really interesting. So this was a survey question that we asked as part of our DevOps survey, and we said, what are the skills lacking in your DevOps implementation? And I thought the top two responses were really interesting. So the second response, 37%, said that they were lacking IT ops skills. 39% was a more sort of general response, domain expertise that included IT ops as a potential domain expertise that they're lacking. So, you know, this is definitely something that organizations that are using DevOps are noticing, that they don't have the ops skills or expertise that they want in their implementation. And also, I think that this idea of centralizing some functions, I think that there's some organizations that resist that. So there's a lot of enterprises that I've seen that have embraced DevOps and really like the idea of those groups being totally autonomous. And obviously there's a lot of advantages to being autonomous in terms of moving fast, but I would argue that there's some functions that are better centralized. And in fact, I think that most businesses are really well set up. They already have a centralized organization that can pivot and take on a slightly different role, like I was talking about before. So this was more of a general question that we asked, and we found that 73% of people said that they have a centralized IT team. And I think it makes sense, again, to use an existing ops organization that might be in that centralized IT team to do some things like potentially run monitoring tools like a service, maybe act like a center of excellence that can advise DevOps teams on the best approach to monitoring and automation and things like that. And so, yeah, I think that that's a really good approach, and it's something that I've been seeing more and more organizations try and actually execute successfully. So with that, I am going to hand over to Mohan.
All right, thank you, Nancy. Those were some very interesting insights, and I'm actually going to refer to a few of those as I talk about what we at BigPanda see in terms of the future of IT ops, being autonomous. So before I jump into it very quickly, just a brief background for me. So I've actually spent close to 16 years at this point in IT ops. For the first several years, I actually deployed various IT ops and monitoring solutions like Netcool, HP NNM, BMC Petrol, Concord eHealth. For those of you that have been around for a while, if you remember what that was, various Tivoli products, etc. Also did a fair bunch of architecture work, working very closely with NOC teams and IT ops teams. And I eventually transitioned into pre-sales and technical marketing, and finally crossed over to the dark side into marketing. So that's my background. So with that, let's talk about what's going on in the world of IT ops. So I think especially those of you that are familiar or have been around for a few years in this space are probably pretty familiar with the state of your IT ops teams or your NOC teams, which end up in many cases looking something like this, right? So you have your legacy infrastructure and applications, you have your modern infrastructure applications. Nancy talked about the complexity of existing legacy applications, the rise of the hybrid environments, primarily and in many cases as a response to rising customer expectations. So as a result of that, you end up with this, what I call the Franken mess of monitoring tools, where every team, every group has basically accumulated or built or acquired a number of different monitoring tools. Companies that we talk to typically have between 20, 30, and 50 monitoring tools. This is one instance where I think it's like a Fortune 500 company that had 1,000 different instances of monitoring tools, which obviously gives rise to mind-boggling complexity in terms of what IT ops looks like. So anyway, so all of these tools generate an enormous amount of noise that really overwhelms your L1s, and then your L2s and L3s and DevOps obviously suffer from the fallout of having this enormous, overwhelming tsunami of IT noise. And obviously then you add in other tools into the mix like ticketing and paging, notification and chat, and pretty much every single functional area that's associated with IT ops is basically suffering. And a simpler distillation of that would be to say, IT ops is really drowning because there's too many alerts coming in, too many incidents that legacy IT ops platforms and IT ops solutions are just not equipped or designed to handle, which then means that the teams inside of your ticketing, chat, and notification systems are also drowning and suffering. So that, I think, broadly is the lay of the land from, our perspective. When we talk to prospects, when we talk to customers, we also talk to other technology companies out there. I think these observations are echoed on a very consistent basis. What does all of that mean for someone who's down in the trenches, right? And it basically means that all of this IT complexity and the monitoring, tool proliferation that Nancy mentioned before, creates all of this noise, which then means that when you're in the midst of an alert storm, or in the midst of an outage or a serious performance and availability problem, your teams are basically inundated with symptoms and false positives, which then means that from a root cause perspective, which Nancy also alluded to, it also means that the root cause analysis process becomes very difficult. Now, and it's one thing when you're basically in a post-mortem where the issue's been resolved, customers are happy, your phone lines are not blowing up, but when you're actually in the middle of that storm and that outage where your business units are unhappy, your customers are complaining, etc., all of these false positives mean that your actual root cause event or the root cause alert is very, very deep inside. So it takes a long time, an unacceptably long time to get to that root cause event, which then means that you really can be proactive. Because the one view or the one way we think of it and we hear is, a lot of times when you have a crippling outage, it's not as if that outage just happens out of the blue. I mean, there's probably a handful of instances where that is true, but in the majority of cases, it's almost like there's all these symptoms and precursors to this massive outage that basically starts somewhere. But because it's buried in this tsunami of noise, it's very hard for teams to get to a P3 or a P2 or a SEF3 or a SEF2, depends on how you call it. It's very hard for them to get to that one early precursor warning event before it eventually escalates into this crippling, headline-grabbing P1 or a P0. And that obviously is a huge problem. And I think a lot of IT ops, NOC, and increasingly DevOps teams are caught in this vicious cycle. It's very hard to break out of it, based on the complexity, based on the tools, and also, I think increasingly, based on the skills gaps that exist, or actually not exist, but that have started to appear in more and more enterprises these days. Obviously, this takes a toll on enterprises. Your MTTR starts to creep up. Your services and applications, start to suffer degradations and performance issues. Customers and users are unhappy, and at the extreme, it basically gets you into the headlines, right? You have a $60 million outage that, like for example, if you're an airline, it basically means that passengers are sleeping on the terminal floors. If you're a trading company, your traders are basically not able to make any trades, with stocks and bonds and options for a few days. So all kinds of negative things start to happen. And meanwhile, if you're in the trenches, if you're an IT ops, in the NOC or a part of a DevOps team, your productivity takes a hit because despite burning the proverbial midnight oil or, these days the 24/7 oil, you really can't just seem to get ahead of the problem. So from a cost perspective, the enterprise, pays in terms of rising OpEx and operational costs. Performance and availability for critical services takes a hit. And then this is especially bad, I think, today because, most enterprises, especially the traditional enterprises, are investing hundreds of millions of dollars into transforming digitally and launching new services. And then when you do that and you spend, let's say, 6 months and $200 million doing that, and then you start to have these really bad performance availability problems, that's the result that's obviously not acceptable to the C-suite. It's not acceptable to the CEO. There's a lot of negative fallout from that. So in terms of, how do enterprises cope with these problems, it's really hard. It's really hard because, in many cases, it comes down to choosing between what's the least worst choice, right? We see some companies ending up in a situation where they invest, millions of dollars into a bunch of tools, and then they end up turning off some of those tools because they would rather not get inundated with all of the noise that happens. They would rather actually wait for someone else to tell them when there's an outage. And, remarkable as that may sound, it's unfortunately fairly common, and we see many instances of that. The next one, which actually seemingly is a simpler solution, but also ineffective, is to grow headcount. And the problem with that, and I think as we heard from Nancy, in terms of the workloads increasing, with the skills gaps and the complexity, just growing headcount or throwing bodies at a problem really doesn't solve it because it's expensive and not scalable. Now, the third one, which we see, which is somewhat related to the turning of the tools coping mechanism, is to rely on customers to report that there's an outage, that there's a problem with an app or a service. And, again, this is something that is very indicative of reality, but obviously it's a terrible, terrible option because, that means that your SLAs are basically shot. You may have, SLA penalties, SLA chargebacks, etc. And it's generally also not a very good idea from a brand perspective because your reputation takes a hit. And the last one, which is, has been in and out of fashion for the last 15, 20 years, which is to buy or trust that a suite of products, usually from a single vendor, will actually solve all of your problems. I think from an integration perspective, you could definitely argue that it's good because if it's from one vendor, they know how to make all of these moving parts work together. But then you end up in many cases with, as opposed to having a series of best-of-breed tools, you end up with a mediocre monolith, from a single vendor that does many things in a very mediocre way. The other problem we see is that, enterprises tend to get locked into a single vendor. And then eventually, when the unhappiness from that monolith gets to a point where you want to switch out, it becomes very hard because switching costs are very high when you're basically locked into a single vendor. So in the context of all of this, I think one of the most transformative things that's happened in the last 5 years, and especially the last 2 years, I would say, is that AI and ML, so artificial intelligence and machine learning, are actually able to transform IT ops. And where 15 years ago you had a really manual or rules-based systems, you're now starting to see IT ops platforms and tools be automated and actually starting to move towards an autonomous mode of operation, which I think is fantastic news for most enterprises, because if you're an IT ops and all of the problems with rising complexity, the skills gap, and customer expectations, then having various aspects of your IT ops processes and incident management become automated, become autonomous is fantastic, because that actually has the ability to drive very clear and compelling benefits in terms of lower MTTR and happier customers. So before we talk about that, let's actually spend just a second, and only because there's so much hype and so much buzz around AI and ML, because I think some of these things get lost in the process. But let's spend a second talking about why should you end up actually using AI and ML in IT ops. I think for me it actually comes down to 4 specific reasons. AI and ML are amazing at processing very large data sets in real time or near real time. So what this means is, especially from an IT ops perspective, if you have hundreds of thousands of alerts generated by your 50, 60, 100, 1,000 monitoring tools, AI and ML powered platforms are able to process all of that data in just a very small number of seconds. So in almost real time, or actually in many cases, even real time. That's the C. While they do that, or as they do that, AI and ML-powered tools are also able to uncover insights that would either be impossible for human IT ops teams to uncover, or uncover insights that are just going to take too long for human IT ops teams to uncover. And last but not the least, the 4th reason, which I think is one of the most compelling reasons, is just like with humans, IT ops tools powered by AI and ML are able to learn and optimize over time, and they actually become better and better the more data that we feed them. And this is, obviously not a very abstract concept anymore. And we see that with everything from, for example, Gmail to maybe your social media, news feeds, increasingly, banking applications, personal finance applications, etc., where more and more, the more data you feed them, the longer you use them, and they learn about what matters to you and what's important, they are autonomously able to surface the insights that you need to make key decisions in that moment. And IT ops, I think, is no different. So finally, after, I guess, many years or even decades of AI, being very hyped up and neural networks and so on and so forth, finally, in the last 5 years, and especially the last 2 years, we're starting to see AI and ML make a very tangible difference in this space. So drilling down one level deeper, if you look at IT ops and specifically the incident management process, what does this mean? So we actually think of the incident management process as consisting of 3 broad steps, which is you detect an incident, you investigate an incident, and you resolve the incident. Now, what does that mean? Detection is obviously detecting the incident, and also especially if you have a large IT ops and DevOps team, making sure that your teams are acknowledging that event or that incident, right? Then, once you know that there's an incident, you probably kick off a bunch of workflows based on your workbooks or playbooks to find out what's causing it, which gets us into the investigate phase where you try to find the root cause. Then once you know what the root cause is, then you issue a fix or you issue a command or you actually do something manual to fix the process. So the detect, investigate, resolve incident life cycle. So in that, I think what we're seeing is with AI and ML, the incident detection process has actually now become autonomous. In the overwhelming majority of cases, enterprises using the right AI and ML powered IT ops tools are able to autonomously detect a problem. In many cases, actually in most cases, the root cause identification has also become automated. We're actually starting to see that shift one step closer to even becoming autonomous, which I think has amazing and tremendous ramifications for enterprises. Because if you look at MTTR, the mean time to repair, and you kind of break it down or decompose it down into its constituent steps, the maximum amount of time that companies, actually not maximum, the most amount of time companies spend is either in detecting the problem or investigating it. And if you drill down one level deeper, you actually find that the lion's share of time is spent on investigating the problem and finding the root cause. So anything that AI and ML can do to shift you away from automated, getting to automated is great, but then they can get you one step closer to autonomous. I think it helps drive down the MTTR metric significantly. And I think we're starting to see tools increasingly able to do that. And the last part, which is the resolution step, is again critical, but I think from a time perspective, it's probably something that takes lesser time than detection or investigation. Because in these cases, you're most likely either doing something manually or connecting to some kind of orchestration tool, which, for example, StackStorm is something that we see quite a bit. You're connecting to some kind of orchestration tool to issue a command on a server or connect to an application and basically change a config and so on and so forth. And there also, we're starting to see many enterprises starting to use, obviously, various automation tools and slowly starting to make that process autonomous as well. So net-net, if you look at the incident management lifecycle, I think AI and ML are actually moving this entire process end-to-end towards an autonomous mode of operation, which I think couldn't come sooner just based on the fact that the complexity and rising customer expectations coupled with the skills gap, I think makes it very timely and essential. So with that, I guess before from a PSA or a public service announcement perspective, but before you actually adopt AI and ML and IT ops, I think there's a small number of caveats that enterprises should keep in mind. So the first one is time to value, because I think most companies and most of you on this webinar, probably have heard of the fact that it takes time to train your AI and ML tools. So the first question you should really ask yourself, especially when you evaluate a brand new IT ops tool that uses AI and ML, is what's the time to value? How long does it take to train the system? Is it weeks? Is it months? Or is it years? Second one is to really make sure, and I would actually say at all costs, to avoid the black box problem with AI and ML, because AI has this classic black box issue where it's opaque, its inner workings are really unknown to most practitioners or users, and it's very, very hard to control the results generated by a lot of AI and ML powered systems, which I think creates a lot of issues, especially in IT ops, because the last thing you want is someone who's an L1 engineer to blame the system and say that the black box AI or the black box ML made me, delete that alert or acknowledge it or deprioritize it. So you absolutely need to shine a very powerful light on the inner workings of how your AI and ML algorithms are working, and you need to be able to control the results that those systems generate, because then that means that your teams can actually trust and rely on those tools, which then leads to successful adoption and successful ROI realization. The third caveat, I think I actually just spoke to that, which is to make sure you ensure adoption and also make sure that these systems are easy to learn and use and maintain. And last but not the least, I think for those of us that have been in enterprise IT for a while, and we know that adopting a new enterprise IT system or tool takes time. And once something is entrenched and once a brand new platform or system is plugged into everything else, it's very painful to rip and replace that with something else. So I think it's of paramount importance that any new AI and IT ops tool that you adopt works out of the gate with your existing IT ops tools and platforms. So just four things to keep in mind there. Now, if you were to successfully adopt an autonomous ops platform, what does success look like? I mean, there are a couple of examples just based on what we have seen. A large global semiconductor manufacturer uses an autonomous ops platform, and one of the first things they saw was a 98% reduction in alert noise, which obviously has significant positive downstream ramifications for them. A large global software tools provider ended up realizing an 85% reduction in TTR over 4 to 6 months once they start using an autonomous ops platform. And the final one is, and I think this is kind of important because most enterprises run IT ops two ways. They either rely on an incident management system that has a console, displays all of your incidents, is designed to be used by hundreds of L1s, L2s, L3s at the same time, or you can actually use your IT ops platform as in a headless mode, and all of your workflows can be triggered from a ticketing system, with the service desk team looking at incoming tickets and working on them based on the priorities. So in those cases, I think it's very important to also be able to reduce the number of tickets that these teams use. So with a large media conglomerate, really a global giant, they ended up realizing an 85% reduction in the volume of tickets over time, which I think is also pretty significant for IT ops. So having said all of this, I want to take a minute to talk about BigPanda. So BigPanda's autonomous operations platform, which uses a very unique version of machine learning that we call an open box machine learning technology, or algorithms, help you also successfully transform your own IT ops systems. With BigPanda, what you end up seeing is you basically fire hose all of the monitoring alerts and events from your existing monitoring tool stack into BigPanda. BigPanda uses our proprietary open box machine learning algorithms to correlate all of these alerts together and create a very small number of incidents with probable root cause that is then which are then automatically routed to your L1s, L2s, or L3s in the NOC, or to DevOps teams that are outside the NOC. And very importantly, BigPanda is able to work out of the gate with your existing ticketing systems like ServiceNow, Jira, Sharewell, and so on and so forth. They're also able to automatically route incidents into Slack or other chat systems you might be using. And last but not the least, also intelligently route incidents to your DevOps teams and L3s, that might be using tools like PagerDuty, Xmatters, Ops Genie, or VictorOps. And what we see is with customers that use BigPanda's autonomous ops platform, they tell us that this has been a very effective, pragmatic way to adopt AI and ML. The time to value is super rapid. Most of BigPanda's customers go live in 8 to 10 weeks. It also is a way to keep your existing best-of-breed tools. Our philosophy is that we trust you that you selected a best-of-breed tool stack because it works for you, your team, and your enterprise. So we want to make sure that we work with your existing best-of-breed tools. And on a related note, it also means that it's minimally disruptive. There's no rip and replace requirements that we place on enterprises. So with that, if any of that sounds interesting and appealing, we'd love to obviously talk to you more. You can contact us on our website at bigpanda.io, or find us on Twitter, send us a message, and we'll be in touch with you. So with that, I thank you for your time, and let's now switch over to Q&A. Colleen, back to you.
Thanks, Nancy and Mohan. It's now time for a Q&A session. As a reminder, simply type your question in the box on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can. Our first question today is, we're looking for a high-impact ROI for future ops/AI ops. Any suggestions? Where should we focus?
I'll give that a stab, and Mohan, you probably have some comments there as well. I would say every organization is different, and so the best way to get ROI is to figure out where your weaknesses are and focus on those. And I think that one mistake people do is not identifying those weaknesses or not identifying them accurately. So, I would recommend measuring your team performance in terms of how long people are spending on what types of tasks. And it's interesting because what I hear is when a lot of organizations go through that process, they discover that things that they thought were taking people a ton of time actually aren't, and that there's other things that are taking tons of time that they didn't realize. And that's one good way to focus on your problem areas and then turn to the solution. And so if you're looking for, an AI ops type of solution, and I'm using air quotes over here, I would look at very specific. So, I think it was great that Mohan took things back to the basics and said, when we're talking about AI and machine learning and AI ops, there's a lot of buzz. So what are we talking about exactly? Why is AI and machine learning useful in a lot of these tools? And so you can begin to look for tools that are maybe embracing some machine learning and AI technologies in ways that are going to help you solve some of these problems that you've identified. So that would be my recommendation. Mohan, do you have something to add?
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty spot on, Nancy. I think it really comes down to, what is your biggest problem right now? And I think that should determine, where you start to maximize the ROI and the impact. And I think what we see is, and that's basically why, I did like you said, Nancy, the back to basics, which is in almost all cases, we see that the fundamental and the first problem that enterprises have is overwhelming, noise that prevents them from detecting problems in time. So I think if enterprises were to start there and basically achieve or get to autonomous detection of incidents and autonomous detection of problems, I think that, immediately it makes sure that your IT ops and NOC teams know what's wrong as soon as it starts to happen, right? Not an hour later, not 2 hours later. And then I think that has a lot of really positive downstream implications, because that means that you can then, more easily find the root cause. It means that you can more easily now, investigate and prioritize. If you need to, quote unquote, wake up a DevOps expert, right, a DevOps engineer at 2 in the morning, as opposed to waking up 25 people and then getting on a bridge call for 3 hours, which I don't think is anyone's idea of a fun night. I think it actually makes it easier to make sure you're very laser focused on the right incident, going to the right person with the right kind of context and information. So I would say detection, I think, is really where it all kind of begins in my mind.
The next question is for Mohan. What was the value prop for automation cost to value?
That's an interesting one. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but let me take a shot at it. So in terms of the ROI, or maybe another way I would maybe look at it is, what are the ways in which automation creates value for customers? So I would say, if you were to embrace an autonomous ops platform, the way you would do that would be, you would basically be able to optimize the time that your L1 teams spend. So basically, it's reduced, L1 IT ops costs, which then means that your L2s and L3s are also spending a significantly reduced amount of time on problems. Because I think today, as I think many of us can agree, what's happening is that L2s and L3s are increasingly outside the NOC, and these are high-value, scarce DevOps resources who might be on a critical project trying to basically get this brand new app or a brand new update released 5 days from now. And the absolute last thing they want is to get pulled into a very painful, super long bridge call, or a bridge call from hell, if you will, where you spend 8 hours or 16 hours trying to diagnose what a problem is. So by being able to reduce the amount of noise and being able to get to the incidents right away, it means that all these high-value resources can continue to work on the strategic projects that they have. The third one would be, similarly, your service desk personnel are spending a significantly reduced amount of time on tickets. We see a lot of data in the market where enterprises have quantified the cost of each service desk ticket to be in the $22 to $44 range. So if you can now reduce that by 50, 60, 70, or 85% in the example I showed you, then that's like a game-changing amount of savings, cost savings by going autonomous. I think there's definitely more there, but I think that's hopefully I answered the question.
Great. I have another question for you, Mohan. What business value does automation lead to? What is the difference between automated versus manual companies?
The one word to answer that would be quality. Because again, in some cases, you could argue that, you could have a large and an ever-growing team of, human IT ops personnel, looking at events and incidents and trying to find out what's wrong and why and when and where. That's one dimension, right? But that does not necessarily mean that the quality of their efforts is going to be high, because like we discussed a few minutes ago, in today's highly complex hybrid environments where you have stuff on-prem, stuff in the cloud, maybe multi-cloud, etc., it's nearly humanly impossible to detect the problem in time and surface the probable root cause manually. So again, you can throw a lot of bodies at it and eventually hope to get to the right answer, but I think you can short circuit that by being automated, becoming autonomous, and actually have that information be presented to you in this, and hopefully what is a easy to use simple console.
Nancy, the next question is for you. How do you see the division of labor shaking out? What should the IT ops team do versus the operations functions done in the DevOps teams?
Yeah, and this is a bit of a moving target. I think there's a lot of experimentation going on here, but and I referenced some of this earlier, but I think that a lot of what I'm seeing people do successful is treat the central IT ops team as something of a center of excellence for monitoring. So in some cases, that team will set policies in terms of how DevOps teams need to instrument and otherwise monitor their applications so that they're sure to be collecting the kind of data that you need to be able to get insight into performance. That centralized team might be managing the tools themselves and offering them as a service and helping the DevOps teams get the most out of those tools, because I have talked to teams that tell me that they think they get like 30% of the benefit out of some of the monitoring and incident response tools that they're using, because if you're a DevOps team, you might be dedicating some portion of a person's time to managing these tools. They just don't have the time to get the most out of them. So that's a good function for that centralized team. And another good function for the centralized team is to sometimes do soup to nuts ops for shared resources that maybe a bunch of different DevOps teams rely on. And then otherwise, the DevOps teams end up being responsible for the code itself and sort of soup to nuts monitoring and performance related to the code that they're working on. But those are sort of some basics that I see in terms of the division of labor in these organizations that are really evolving their IT ops organizations.
So we have time for one final question today. Do you have any advice for closing skills gaps around automation?
Mohan, do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
And Nancy, I think you would actually be great at it, so go ahead, please.
Okay. Yeah, it's the skills gap issue it's a perennially difficult nut to crack. So there's obviously certification processes that people can go through to gain new skills. There's a lot of, on-the-job work, sort of trial and error that I think goes on in a lot of organizations. But what I find is really critical is that, the company has to support retraining. And we actually have some really interesting research where we've asked people what's their preferred response to their preferred approach to closing the skills gap, and the top answer is retrain existing people. And then when we ask, what are spending priorities, investing in retraining is the very bottom priority. So, teams want to retrain and beef up skills in order to close the gap by using existing team members, but usually companies are very often not willing to invest in it. So I think that's actually sort of the toughest hurdle is, convincing the powers that be that they should be investing in that kind of retraining. So kind of a general answer there, but I think those are some really key things in terms of trying to beef up skills around automation.
Thank you to both you, Nancy and Mohan. That concludes today's webcast. As a reminder, the on-demand replay will be available on 24 soon. On behalf of BigPanda and 451 Research, thank you so much for attending, and have a great day.
Thank you very much.